Picture this. It's January 1940, and you're standing in line at your local shop in London, clutching a small booklet that will determine whether you eat meat this week or go without. This isn't some dystopian fiction. This was reality for millions of people during World War II. That little booklet was your ration book, filled with precious coupons that had become as valuable as money itself. The war that raged from 1939 to 1945 didn't just reshape maps and topple governments. It completely transformed how ordinary people lived, worked, ate, and dreamed. Every aspect of daily existence became touched by the conflict, from the breakfast table to the factory floor, from the movie theater to the farm field. Let's start with something as basic as putting food on the table. In Britain, the government knew they had a problem. The island nation imported much of its food, and German submarines were prowling the Atlantic, sending supply ships to the bottom of the ocean. So in January 1940, rationing began. Suddenly, buying meat, sugar, butter, or even tea required those little coupons. You couldn't just walk into a shop with money anymore. You needed permission from the government to purchase the basics of life. The Ministry of Food became one of the most important government departments, not because it wielded military power, but because it controlled something even more fundamental: sustenance. They encouraged people to dig up their flower gardens and plant vegetables instead. Cattle farming, which required imported feed, gave way to sheep farming since sheep could simply graze on grass. The government even took over farms they deemed inefficient, displacing the original tenants in pursuit of maximum food production. Imagine losing the land your family had worked for generations because bureaucrats in London decided you weren't productive enough for wartime needs. But perhaps the most fascinating part was how families adapted. The government didn't just hand out ration books and wish people luck. They produced leaflets with recipes designed for limited ingredients, broadcast cooking tips on the radio, and tried to help housewives navigate this new reality. Still, complaints poured in from factory workers and farmers who argued that people doing physical labor needed larger food allowances. The system was far from perfect, and hunger was a real concern for many. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Americans were experiencing their own version of wartime rationing. Victory gardens sprouted in backyards across the country as families were encouraged to grow their own vegetables to support the war effort. Children collected scrap metal, rubber, and paper in massive drives that turned recycling into a patriotic duty. Everything was being redirected toward the war machine. Resources that once made consumer goods now built tanks, planes, and battleships. But perhaps the most dramatic change was in who was working and where. With millions of men shipped overseas to fight, the workforce at home was transformed almost overnight. The famous Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a propaganda poster. She represented real women who were suddenly building aircraft, welding ships, and operating machinery that had been considered men's work just months before. In rural America, women found themselves harvesting crops and managing farms. The William A. Bennett family papers, preserved in archives, tell the story of how women in farming communities took on roles they'd never imagined, working in fields to prevent food shortages. This wasn't just about women's liberation. It was about survival, about keeping the country fed and equipped while the men were away fighting. The changes went far beyond work and food. Your entertainment, your news, even your thoughts were being shaped by the war effort. Hollywood churned out patriotic films that painted the enemy as pure evil and the Allied cause as righteously heroic. Radio broadcasts reminded families daily of their duty to buy war bonds, conserve resources, and maintain morale. Propaganda wasn't a dirty word then. It was considered essential for victory. But this massive mobilization came with a dark side that we can't ignore. In America, fear and racial prejudice led to one of the most shameful episodes in the nation's history. After Pearl Harbor, over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them US citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes and imprisoned in internment camps. Families lost everything: their businesses, their properties, their freedom. The government's own records, preserved in the National Archives, document this systematic violation of civil rights carried out in the name of national security. Hawaii lived under martial law after the Pearl Harbor attack, and across the country, the government investigated suspected spies and subversives. Civil liberties that Americans had taken for granted suddenly became casualties of war. The very democracy they were fighting to preserve seemed to be eroding at home. In Britain, life had its own unique hardships. Air raids weren't something you read about in newspapers. They were something you lived through. The wail of sirens would send families scrambling for bomb shelters or underground stations. Blackout curtains became mandatory, showing even a sliver of light could bring fines or worse, guide enemy bombers to their targets. Children in London and other cities were evacuated to the countryside, separated from their parents for months or years at a time. For families on both sides of the Atlantic, separation became a defining experience. Fathers, sons, and brothers were scattered across the globe, fighting in jungles, deserts, and frozen battlefields. Communication happened through letters, or V-mail as it was called. That took weeks or months to arrive. Families treasured these letters, reading and rereading them for any hint that their loved ones were safe. The archives are filled with diaries and letters that reveal the emotional toll of this separation. The Myrtle E. Fortune diary and the Reuben Berman family papers provide intimate glimpses into how families coped with anxiety, loneliness, and the constant fear that the next telegram might bring devastating news. Yet these same documents also show remarkable resilience: neighbors helping neighbors, communities coming together, and small acts of kindness that kept hope alive. Children experienced the war in their own unique way. School might be disrupted by air raids or cancelled entirely for evacuation, but they also became part of the war effort, collecting scrap metal, helping in victory gardens, and participating in civil defense activities. In many ways, childhood innocence became another casualty of the global conflict. The war also became a catalyst for social change that would reshape society for decades to come. African Americans seized wartime opportunities to challenge segregation and discrimination. If they were good enough to work in defense plants and fight overseas, they argued, they were good enough for equal treatment at home. The seeds of the civil rights movement were planted in the wartime factories and military units of the 1940s. But let's not romanticize this period. Daily life during World War II was hard, really hard. Beyond food rationing, civilians faced shortages of clothing, fuel, and basic consumer goods. People learned to repair everything because replacements simply weren't available. Make do and mend wasn't just a slogan, it was a survival strategy. The mental health toll was enormous, though it wasn't well understood at the time. The constant stress of separation, loss, and threat wore people down. Letters and diaries frequently mention anxiety, depression, and grief that had no outlet or professional treatment. Families simply had to endure and hope for better days. Some policies remain controversial even today. The British government's decision to take over farms deemed inefficient sounds reasonable in theory, but it meant real families losing their livelihoods and homes. Was this necessary for victory, or an overreach of government power? The documents exist, but the human cost is harder to quantify. Similarly, propaganda campaigns were undeniably extensive. But did they actually work? Government records show what messages were sent out, but measuring their impact on civilian morale is much more difficult. People wrote what they thought they should write in letters that might be censored. making it hard to know their true feelings. What emerges from all these government records, military correspondence, diaries, and museum collections is a picture of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. They showed remarkable adaptability, tremendous sacrifice, and incredible resilience. They also made mistakes, suffered through terrible policies, and endured hardships that we can barely imagine today. The home front during World War II wasn't just about supporting the boys overseas, it was about the complete transformation of society itself. When victory finally came in 1945, the world these civilians returned to was fundamentally different from the one they'd left behind. Women had proven themselves in roles previously reserved for men. Racial minorities had begun demanding equality. Government had taken on responsibilities unimaginable before the war.